What is the Matrix? Control. Built to keep us under control and to transform us into fuel for the machine. MaxAnte offers you these transmissions as messages for those of you that sense that things are not as they appear. In a worldwide culture under systematic, mechanized, hypnotic obedience, which right now is seeking to take even more control of you and everyone else. We respond by uncovering hidden truths, hacking through the systems, implementing new ways of freedom, and tuning more into joy. If this resonates, you'll feel it inside and know that these messages are for you. If anything doesn't resonate at this time, don't try to make it fit, just let it go. And keep in mind, everything here is paradoxical, not to be taken as literal advice, nor to be taken too seriously, because after all, this is your tour on Earth. Rejecting the listening. So, inside this episode, I'm going to discuss one of the key ways that people deliberately don't tune into the listening. They actually reject it. They're so in their egoic identity, they're so identified with their mental structure and what they're doing, that they push away the feedback. They override it by living with delusion and illusion. So let's have a look at one of the main ways that people override the listening, don't dive into it. They reject it, and they come from what they believe they are going to be doing and how they can win through no matter what. It will be different for me. That is a very common feeling among pretty much most humans. They have this sense that they're going to go ahead and do this thing that they're going to do, and while it might not have worked out for other people, well, I'm going to show the world. It's going to be different for me. Well, just start having a look at that. Really, like, who is speaking there? I would suggest that it's coming from a very strong egoic consciousness. It's coming from this idea that there is a me and a willpower, a sense of free will that will determine the outcome, that will push through and make this thing happen. Well, how about somebody signing up for the military? There they are, putting their life literally at risk, because they're saying, well, I'm even willing to serve my country, and all that patriotism, because what they're really aligning and believing into is that the government is good, that the government is not a gangster organization that's been set up to propagate and ensure its own power structure, to steal from the people by taking taxes, and then to monopolize various industries, and to even go to war to secure its resources. So they've bought into the whole model that the government has sold to them, and now they're willing to put their life on the line. But in the background, what they're thinking is something like, oh, this won't happen to me. So they're thinking like, I could even be sent to war, but I won't be the one to cop a bullet. What's another example? Like, let's just take a look at marriage, for example. So I think worldwide now, or certainly in many countries, the statistics are like 50% of divorce. And yet, if you interview those people on that day, they will tell you, oh no, it's going to be different for me. That's just one of the examples. So even though they're possibly opening themselves up for many troubles in life, where they will get potentially in such a divorce, they may lose most of their possessions, have things stolen, taken from them. All these sort of events can happen to somebody in such a situation. And so, but there they are walking into it, often just with their heart wide open, thinking that everything's going to be great because this won't happen to me. What's another example? Or maybe maybe you're playing with drugs. Maybe you're playing with very intense substances. And you've heard, obviously, stories in the media that people can get very sick, very ill, even die sometimes. Somebody who's like shooting up with heroin or something like that, where they're saying, well, but this won't happen to me. So that's what they're thinking. They're thinking that it's going to be okay. I just recently met somebody who's Russian, and I didn't realize that Russian roulette is a real thing that people literally today, lots of them in Russia, play at parties. They drink a huge amount of vodka. They all get smashed and drunk, and then they pull out the gun, the revolver. They put a bullet in and they spin it. And that's how they play the game. Every round, they put it to their head, but they spin it around, so there's only a 1 in 6 chance. And the person who told me this, she had actually in her life, at various parties in Moscow and in Russia, she tried it 3 times. So what do you think is the main thing? I asked her, like, why did you do that? What are you thinking? She just told me straight out, it won't happen to me. So that's the idea here, is that, somebody's even willing to spin a barrel of a gun with a bullet in it. And so strong is this idea. That's why I'm wanting to show it to you. I've given you several other examples. I can go through many others. People who are climbing Everest. Just check out the stats this year, how many have died. I can guarantee you that those people, they were really into mountaineering, and they would say to you before they went up, oh, that won't happen to me. You just go through the list. What about people who are racing cars, zooming super fast, any of these things? Pretty much most people have this view, oh, that won't happen to me. Well, what if you really start getting real with all of this and start tuning in to what's going on? There are odds. And so when you play with fire, then invariably, sometimes things will happen. Have you noticed that this is a dangerous realm? People do get killed here. Every day, look at the road accidents, look at the stats. People are, obviously you're getting into a vehicle to drive. Maybe you're just driving to work or driving home or going on a ride on the weekend. Now, obviously, you've probably done that, thousands of times, and nothing happened. So the odds are very less. It's better than playing Russian roulette, where you've got a 1 in 6 chance of blowing your head off. And yet people die continuously in Russia, presumably, maybe even elsewhere, playing that game at parties as a party trick. Blow your head off. People have to mop you up afterwards. Great party trick. So the odds are much higher in those sort of situations, as probably potentially even with shooting up with heroin. Maybe you've just gone and bought some smack on the street, and you're just thinking, oh, this is going to be a bit of a blast. I'll just knock myself out. And but there are the odds. There are higher odds in basically dying in those sort of situations than, let's say, just getting into your car and driving to work. So now, while there is inherent risk in even getting out of bed in the morning, starting your day, because there are people who die just every day just by going about their normal activities, but that is very, very minimal. So I'm not recommending that you don't do anything. Obviously, life is a risk, but life is here to be enjoyed, and there's nothing wrong with taking risks. I take a lot of risks, but they're very calculated. So even in my work, in my business life, I'm always taking risks, but they're always very calculated, because I understand I have to manage risk. See, risk is something to manage. Now, once you've understood that, then you can start to play the game much better, because this game is life. Life is a game here to be played, and there are so many risks to so many different areas. And what you want to understand is probabilities. You want to start thinking in probabilities, like what is the chances of this happening? You could just start looking at the odds, because people have done this analysis in so many different things. In starting a business, what are the odds with that? In getting married, what are the odds with that? With joining the military, what are the odds? What are the stats here? And so once you've at least acknowledged it, once you've actually, then obviously, if you still want to go ahead with it, go for it. If you want to try that, if you want to join the military and sign up and go to war, if you want to, drive a racing car and go super fast, if you want to get into a wingsuit and jump out of a plane and zoom through the air, do you know how many people died in making the wingsuit? It took about 75 years, I think, to develop the wingsuit to actually fly. And there were 75 people who actually worked on the design. And do you know how many of those 75 died in perfecting the current wingsuit? And you can watch the amazing videos of people flying around in those wingsuits. 74 of them died in making that design. So it was the 75th person. How lucky would you feel? Woohoo! What are some other interesting stats? Like, what about Chuck Yeager? He was the guy who broke through the sound barrier. There were a number of people who were basically attempting to break through the sound barrier before him. And it's a really interesting story where basically, I think there was maybe it was 5 or 6. I don't know. There was certainly a number of them. And so each of them was willing to put their life on the line because they were in the military. They'd signed up for the Air Force, and it was their duty to do this new experiment of going faster and faster. And they were in their jet fighter, and they were just putting the pedal to the metal and zooming, and they were approaching that sound barrier, and everything in the plane was shaking and shaking, and it felt like it was about to explode and go out of control. And they were saying to the control tower, "This is getting out of hand. I'm going so fast. I'm almost at the sound barrier." And they would always say very calmly back to the person, "Well, what do you want to do?" And they said, "Just that they were on that brink of about to go through the sound barrier. They want to pull back." And they pulled back, and the plane exploded, and they died. And so there was so many people, there was a number of people that did this until Chuck Yeager when he did it. And so he'd already understood the odds, imagine that. How courageous is this guy? Let's say there was 5 or 6 people who'd done it before him, and every attempt. And they were so confronted in that terror, in that moment, as the plane was shaking and vibrating, feeling like it was about to explode. And so they backed off. They took it off the metal. So they basically tried to slow down, but that was what blew them up. Whereas Chuck Yeager, at that moment, after all those people had died, and they asked him in the control tower, "What do you want to do, Chuck?" And he said, "I want to go through." And he just pushed it. And he popped through the sound barrier. And there was the explosion, but of sound. And he just hurtled right through it. And everything became super peaceful. It was like he broke through. So that's the other curious thing here. This is why it's so important to feel into the feedback, lean into it. Because sometimes what can appear to be a terrifying situation, but if you do push through, that's why each situation is unique. It's not always that by pushing through do you get a bad result. Sometimes in certain situations you're going to get the best result. In fact, pushing through is what's going to save you. So that's why it's so tricky and curious, this whole life game that we're playing here. Because you can't just say, well, if I just try to play it safe and don't do any of these risky things, that's going to ensure my survival. Not at all. If you want to start looking into the probabilities of people who played life really safe and avoided as many risks as they could, you can see that many of them died as well. And maybe even worse, they lived a very small, shallow life because they were too afraid to take any risks. And so I love taking risks. If you've listened to my stories, you've even heard that I even actually died. I had a near-death experience by taking an almost lethal dose of a substance that completely woke me up. It changed my whole life. I wouldn't take that back at all. I would never take back that experience, even though it risked my whole life. For about 30, 40 minutes, I went blue, and presumably I wasn't breathing or not breathing very much. So I got myself to a point in my life at that point where I was completely willing to risk it all. So there are times maybe when we're actually, okay, we get that. We're like, wow, I get what this is about. And so, however, that's going to be a very unusual situation. You're not going to want to play there's no need to play those sort of risky games all the time. Because we've also spoken about the joy of living and tuning into what it means to have a joyous life here. Let that be your guide. But at the same time, don't kid yourself. This whole paradigm of it's not going to happen to me is delusional. It, at its basis, is an egoic, delusional consciousness that believes that everything is easy, everything's going to work for me here in this world. And it's just not like that. Just look at the stats, how many businesses fail, how many marriages fail, how many people get shot in war, how many people, it just goes on and on. There are so many mistakes that people make because they just blindly walk into it without examining the probabilities, the likelihoods, the possibilities of what could happen to them. Now, you can still go on each of those endeavors, but you want to really examine how to set yourself up for success. How do you set yourself up for success? By examining the risks and taking on board risk management. So, the takeaways are start exploring and examining and learning about probabilities. Start to look at leading your life based upon the probabilities of the outcome. What is the percentage likelihood here? And so as you start to get real, because that's where we actually encounter reality, by researching the probabilities and then layering on top of that, feeling into the feedback, leaning into the listening, because now you understand, you've got real with yourself about what is potentially possible here, and now you're going to take effective action to ensure that you have a greater likelihood of success. And you're going to have benchmarks. You're going to be like, well, if this starts happening, this is when I retreat. This is when I get out. There's nothing wrong with quitting, nothing wrong with retreating. This can be a very smart step because you're playing the long game here. There's an amazing opportunity to explore and live this amazing life in this magical world. Don't take it for granted, and don't think that everything is just going to be easy and there for the taking. This is a very tricky experience, and you need to get really wise to what's going on and how to basically ensure your survival and your success through proper understanding of risks and probabilities.